this is going to be a tutorial on drawing. Looking at all of your beautiful work on the forum, I was just thinking it's really nice to see all of your work developing and all of your painting developing. And we've had one or two questions from beginners saying, or intermediates saying, that they would really like to know how to draw from life. Just a few more hints and tips would be great. So I thought, let's have a look at this beautiful daisy. I'm rather thrilled that we've got these in the garden. And they don't smell very nice, but they look really pretty, and I thought actually they're a great way of teaching ellipses and how to draw a flower at different angles. It's a very complicated flower because it's multi-petaled, and in fact I learnt this from a botanical friend of mine, that each petal on a daisy like this is actually a flower itself. So it's actually a composite of lots of little flowers. But that's too confusing, so we'll just call them petals for this tutorial. And over the years, one develops certain ways of trying to describe things to people, and when I've been teaching over the years, I've come up with little symbols and words and ways of describing stuff to make it easily understandable. So I'm hoping that I don't stutter too much and today, because I really want to try and make this sound as less daunting as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the clock way of looking at things, which is a way of finding your way around the plant and seeing angles really easily, and also being able to work out how many petals are on something and looking at the negative shapes. But it's basically about the angles of the petals helping you find your way around the drawing. One of the things that I do when I'm drawing as well is I'd have it set up and I would measure with my pencil. So I would hold my pencil up against the flower, and I'd have the point of the pencil against one edge of the plant, and then I would move my thumb along and measure to the other edge of the plant, and that will give me a width and a measurement of the flower. So once I've done that measurement, I've then got the width of the flower, and then I can just move my pencil down onto the paper and I mark one end and then mark the other end. It's just a guesstimate, but what you can do is you can use dividers, which will give you a much more precise measurement. One of the things that is really important to think about is that your measurements need to be taken from the same plane. So what I try and do is imagine that there's a sheet of glass right in front of my flower, and I can only move my pencil up and down that sheet of glass. So when I take all of my measurements, they're all from the same length. It's a bit like if you were working out in the field and you were doing a painting of a landscape and you wanted to mark the trees. You would keep your arm at the same length so that the trees are all in proportion with your painting, because if you move your hand forward, you're going to end up with little trees and big trees depending on where you put your arm. So it's the same thing when you're drawing something very close to. Imagine a sheet of glass in front of you and take your measurements from that plane. The minute you start dipping and moving your pencil in and out, your measurements will get skewed. So you've got to imagine that you are the photograph, or it is a photograph in front of you, and it's on a single plane. And then what you do is start looking at it as a sort of flat object. And it's only when you start painting and putting tone and shape and what have you, then that will give you your perspective. So we've got the flower here at a very light angle. And one of the things to think about is ellipses. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about ellipses later on. We're going to just talk about the clock process now, and then we'll talk about angles in just a moment. But basically the flower is a slight angle, so it'll be wider across the flower this way than it will be going backwards and forwards, so it'll just be a little bit narrower there. So I'm just going to take a couple of measurements just to get my depth of flower. It's a little bit precarious. You have to sort of be quite nimble with your arm movements. Just take a couple of little measurements there. So basically I'm trying to get the overall size of the flower on the paper. So if I just make those marks a little bit bigger, you can see what I'm up to. See, I'm getting a nice sort of almost like an oval shape. And then in the centre I'm going to just mark in that busy bit in the middle. beautiful little example of Fibonacci pattern, which is the pattern where the stamen open up, and a lot of flowers follow the same pattern, and it just keeps opening, keeps opening, keeps opening, and you get this wonderful pattern in there. So all we need to do for the purpose of the clock demonstration is just do a very simple guide. So what I've got here is I've got the centre of the flower, and you can do the same idea of measuring as well there to get the size of that right. And then what I do is I look at the petals going away, and each petal, if I put the numbers of the clock here, we've got 12, we've got 9, we've got 3, and we've got 6. I had to think about that for a minute. So if you imagine that that is the face of the clock, and each petal is going out telling a different time. So if we look at this petal here, we're going to take that going out, and it's going to be about 11 o'clock, that petal. So just a simple line. And then if we take this petal coming down here, then that petal's coming just a little bit past 6 o'clock. Sorry, between 5 and 6. So it's about 5:45. And so each little petal will go out to a particular place on the clock. And what I do is I choose 3 or 4, or maybe even 5, get them established as just a single line. So once you've established your main direction of your most prominent petals, you can then start to draw the shape in. And what I tend to do is just have a little look. Again, keeping my my pencil vertical, I just have a little look at the depth of it. So I know that this is going to be fairly short here, this petal, and I'm going to draw it. I'm using a 2B, I'm going to try and draw it a little bit heavier. I'm just going to draw it very quickly, roughly working out the angle and also the shape of it. Once I've got this established, I can then see how far this petal, the next petal along, is away from this one. So I can judge very carefully how far out this petal comes by looking at this shape in between. Now I know this petal's heading up towards 12 o'clock, so I know it's got to go up this way, and I know it's curling over a little bit over to the right, and then I've got a midrib coming through there, which is coming down towards the centre. Everything heads home. So I've got this shape here already telling me which direction that petal's going. I know on the clock it's heading towards 12 o'clock, and I know I can see just how it curls underneath and then how it curves back. So already we've got 2 petals on, and we've only just started, so that's good news. One of the things I tend to do when I'm drawing is close one eye. Now it looks very odd when you see a whole room of art students sitting there drawing with one eye shut. But what that does is it just gives you one fixed view, because obviously when you've got 2 eyes looking at something and you close one eye and close the other eye and one eye and the other eye, you get 2 different jumping images. So if you keep one eye shut, I naturally want to close my right eye. So I close my right eye and I've just got that fixed view. And that does help simplify things. But every now and then you have to make a judgment on whether you go for the left eye or the right eye, or whether it's just a snapshot of something. And sometimes you have to open both eyes in order to see what you're drawing. So here we go, back to this. So we've got a little bit of a negative shape there to take us up there, but it's all about thinking about the clock. So if we then look at the next one, we've got a little gap here, but we've got this petal coming out. It's sitting about here, because even this central piece of the flower has a sort of clock pattern in my head anyway. And from there I can see that the middle of that petal goes out and heads out here. And if I look at the top of the petal here, I know that the next petal down or along is a little bit lower, and I'm guesstimating that it's about 1/2 centimetre. So we then start putting in that petal with its curve going this way, and I can see the distance here, the distance between the top and the bottom, so that I know I've got the right height and length of the petal. By using these negative shapes here, the shapes in between the petals, you don't have to keep measuring with your pencil and moving it backwards and forwards. You can usually find out where you are just by looking at the spaces in between the petals. So there's a little petal falling away at the back there, and all we can see is a little bit of grey. And I'm just looking at this negative shape here and just seeing that that actually needs to be a little bit closer, so I'm just moving those over a little bit. So what we're going to do is just tap that in quickly there. That's curling away. And the midrib is curling up and going back, and it would go out to that little point. So that's another thing to bear in mind, thinking about the midrib. And we've talked about the midrib with the leaves. And if you're not sure about that, then we've got leaf demos all over the place where you can see about midribs and following that through first. So as we move around here, we're still only between 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and we've got 3 petals on, and we can see at 2 o'clock this is this nice petal that's sitting right up here, and this petal here is lovely and bright. You can see the base of it and you can see the gap in between, so I already know that I have brought this angle a little bit too far over, so I just want to change the angle of the base of this petal and just tuck it down a little bit more, because the space in between here is a little bit closer. So I'm just going to draw the edge of this petal in, and we know that it's coming just a little bit higher than this petal because I can see this line here, and we know it's heading to 2 o'clock. So draw that in and just get that petal established. Now then look at the spaces in between and see what you can see, and you'll see the other little petals underneath the lower layer. So we work our way all around the clock looking at these petals, and if you want to, what you can do is you can draw in the major petals that you put the lines for, so that will give you some idea of how much space and width you need to put in and what length as well each petal is. So you can have some little guides going around. And one of the things to notice is here, where I've put this line in, I haven't curved it. This flower sort of bends out, and I've just put these little lines for the direction of my flowers. So really what I want to do is I want to bend these lines so that I get this idea of the petals curving away. So it's still heading to 5:45, but it's got a lovely little curve to it. So that's important to mark that in, rather than have all these little straight lines everywhere. So let's just do a little recap now. We're marking out the direction of the petals. We're looking at where they join onto the centre, so that's important. We're looking to see if they've got a curve, so you could put the curve in at this point, which would help when you're doing the drawing. And we're also looking, once we've got the measurement for the depth of each petal, we're also looking at the spaces in between to make sure that they're sitting correctly next to the other flower. So we'll just draw that in now, and then you can watch how this grows. So you can see that I've completed my little sketch, and what I've done is I've used a 2B so you can see how it goes, because we've done this before and we've used too light a pencil. So when you're sketching, use a pencil that's really comfortable, that's going to give you a really nice good strong line, so you can change your mind as well. And I just used a little eraser there, so any time that I felt like I was making a little mistake, I can just remove it. What I quite like about doing a sketch like this is you can look at those little negative spaces and just sort of shade them in, just to remind yourself of the positioning of everything. You can also look at angles of the end of the petals, so you could put in those little angles here so you get an idea of the different direction that these petals are heading. And you can extend some lines, so if you're looking at the angle of something, you can just do a little extension there to show that this edge heads out that way, this edge is heading out that way. And you could put some little arrows and what have you. You can also look at the overall shape of something, which we did with the measurements, which gives you a nice idea of the overall shape of the flower. And just keep the centre really simple so that you've just got that lovely quick sketch to refer back to. Of course, if you're doing the centre and you want to get a little bit of detail in there, it's always good to take a quick snap of it. But when you're drawing it, it's nice to get an idea of how high the centre rises up. So I tend to look at the centre like so with an oval, and then think, right, okay, the oval is sitting, of the centre is sitting just a little bit higher, so I've got it a bit wrong on that initial sketch, so I can move it up a little bit, like so, and just move it down there. And then what I would do, if I look at this other little sketch that I'm doing here, is I look at the angle at which this centre detail is finishing, so it's that sort of angle. So we've got a centre piece here that is coming short of the edge, so you come just in on there, and then just very gently just get some indication of shape lines to show how it domes out. So just a little bit of doming on that centre piece. And then if you wanted to do a little close-up, you need a little magnifying glass, have a little close-up to see how that works. And then once you've got your magnifying glass telling you what to do, you can start mapping in some of those little details. So if you just sort of give an indication that they're juvenile pollen in the middle, and then the ones that come round on the outside are little cups filled with little pollen. I wouldn't normally, when I'm just sketching a whole flower like this, I wouldn't normally go into the detail on that. What I like to do is I like to get the drawing right, get the shape right, get the passion in the drawing, and then when it comes to the detail, I like to paint it. So if I was doing a study page, I would probably just paint the centre up as a little guide to how it goes. So let's continue talking about drawing. Let's talk about what I call umbrella drawing. So when you've got a flower like this and you turn it round and you see it coming down like so, it's like an umbrella. And actually this is where we start talking about ellipses. I'll just write clock next to this drawing so we remember what that's all about. Horrible writing, I apologise. And now we're going to do umbrella. So umbrella really is, how I'm looking at this flower is that everything's sort of curving down. So we've got an umbrella shape of it. So if you imagine this is the stem of your umbrella and this is the top of the umbrella falling down. But also it's quite nice to think of these shape names when you're putting together a composition of something. So if you were putting together a lovely bouquet of flowers, it's nice to have some umbrella shaped flowers in there to show that the bouquet is moving away from you. So we talked a little bit briefly about ellipses, and an ellipse is basically a circle on a different plane. So if you imagine a circle here, we don't need to imagine it, I can draw it, a bit of a wonky one here. If we then tipped this circle, we would have this sort of shape, and if we tipped it even more, so if it was a flat plane and it was moving away from you, you'd get a thinner circle. So if I put a centre into those ellipses like this and put a little stick on it, you'd see if you were looking down on top of the stick you wouldn't see it. If you're tipping that little disc away you'd see a little bit of the stick, and as you're turning it on its side you'd see more of the little stick. So we do that in reverse for the umbrella. So there's my stem coming down. I'll just remove that little stick there, put my stem there, and put my stem there. So in reverse, you would actually see less of the stick between here and more as you're looking down. I'll just explain that again. So my stem's coming behind, underneath the centre of the flower. So obviously we're seeing more of the top and less of the stem. As we tip it away, we see a little bit more of the stem and less of the top, and then more of the stem and less of the top, until in the end you've got the flower almost directly on its side. You've got a very, very thin ellipse, and you would see probably the underneath or the calyx of the flower. So as soon as it gets to that edge, that's when you're seeing more of the underneath. And as it tips away from you, if we were looking at the underneath of the flower, you'd start to see all of the gubbins going on underneath the flower and virtually all of the stem. So that's what I mean by ellipses, and you'd hear about ellipses in drawing classes as in regards to a jar or a cup. So if you were drawing a cup, looking into it, you would see it as a circle. Tipping it away, you would see it as an ellipse. And ellipses are quite difficult to draw. So one of the things that I used to do to cheat is I would get a drawing of a circle on something like a computer, and then stretch it into an ellipse, and then trace it off a photocopy. But of course you can't always get the size that you want, but it does give you a really good idea of how that curve works, because rather than it being a sausage, it's a very gentle change on the ellipse shape. It's almost like more like a cigar, and then it goes a little bit deeper in the middle. So ellipses are something that if you want to practice, you can practice away with that. It's not necessary to get really perfect at ellipses for flower painting, because it's just a learning tool of realising what angle your flower is sitting at. So let's look at the flower as an umbrella. If I take this one here, this is my most umbrella drawing, so I'm just going to draw straight over that. And what I would do is look at how much I can see going beyond here, so the far distant part of my umbrella. And obviously these petals are very foreshortened. Foreshortened means that it's going away in the distance and you're looking straight at it, so you're sort of getting it really short and really squat. And the way I look at foreshortening is just to look at it as a shape. So look at the shape that's peeking out behind that centre part of your flower, and just draw the shape that you see. So I see this sort of shape because that's the petal that's disappearing behind. And then I see like a little butterfly V here with the other petal going at this angle. So already I've got the top two like little butterfly wings at the top of there. And then I'm going to bring this down and take another petal out here. And at the same time I'm thinking about the umbrella, I'm also thinking about the clock, because obviously this is going off to 11 o'clock if my clock is going this way, and that one's going off to 2 o'clock if my clock is in the same position. So then I would look at the distance here and then bring my lovely petal that's coming down in front of me like so. So I'll get my first petals in, which is really important, just to get your first main petals in so you know which ones are the main key players. I'm just going to draw straight over my ellipse illustration there. And then I've got my other umbrella petal going out this way. And then if we look at the general shape of it, we can then see that it's going to go like this, which is a bigger ellipse, a bigger oval. And then we can fit in our petals accordingly. So just mark in, see where the petals curl, and then mark them back into the centre. And the little foreshortened ones will be quite short and squat, and you'll just see a little shape like that. And then this one over here is just a little tiny one like that, very short. And so we don't get too confused, we'll remove our little ellipse drawing behind. And we'll just mark it in nice and strong so you can see what I'm getting at. So all of these shapes fit in nicely into that little umbrella shape, and the umbrella is what helps me imagine where the petals are falling. So obviously the petals at the back here, we won't see those. We'll just see these lovely petals coming forward, and they'll be our feature petals when we do the painting. Just draw a couple more of these in so you get an idea. Now the next thing to look at, if I just draw my umbrella really clearly, so you've got a nice shape to work from. I'll just tidy up my centre so that we get that a little bit clearer as well. That's the middle. It's curling down. Let's put some little indications of that little bump. So these petals coming forward, each of them will finish at a certain angle. And this is what I was talking about over here on my other drawing, is that each petal will finish at a little angle. And what I do is I offer my pencil up to the base of the petal so I can see the angles, and that way I get the end of the petals correct. And that then gives me a really nice idea of where the midrib comes. Very easy to see the midrib, but not so easy to draw it and get it absolutely right. So think about the ends of the petals and think about the spaces in between. So all of our little drawing techniques all come into play. So you can even shade in a little bit of that negative space if you wanted to. And if you remember that a flower obviously is held together, there's a centre, and I always think of it as a thread coming through the flower, and I think I've mentioned that before in other tutorials, but it's always nice to think about it as home. So if you imagine the very middle of the flower is there, that's, if you like, the life force right in the middle. So the stem is coming to the middle of the flower, the petals are all heading into the middle of the flower, and all of this busy productive part of the flower is all moving out from the centre of the flower. So everything has this movement and this connection, and that also helps you have a look at where the stem goes. If you're just painting the flower and then you think, oh my goodness, I didn't take a shot of which direction the stem goes, if you can in your photograph find the stem, you can follow it through to the centre of the flower, and that way you'll get the stem in the right place. So if I just plop this in here, that's my stem and it's heading off in that direction. To make the handle of the umbrella. So that's umbrella drawing, and I use that umbrella shape to think about putting in dimension and form into a picture. So why do you need to think about clocks and umbrellas? Well, the clock really helps you get everything in the right place and heading in the right direction, and the umbrellas really help you think about, if you are putting a nice composition together, to think about how the angles of the flower will change to give you that feeling of space on the painting that you're doing. So if I just do a very quick sketch, if you were putting like a nice bouquet together and you had your stems, it would be really boring if you just had 1, 2, 3 flat flowers in your composition. So it'd be much nicer if you thought, right, I'm going to have an umbrella here, and I'm going to have an umbrella down here, and then maybe I'll have a lovely full-on flat flower here to show all the detail, but maybe I like to see the underneath over here, so it'd be nice to have it over there and looking away, so you can see several different angles of the flower, which you could do set out as just a plate, so you could show all the different angles of the flower, or you could collide them together to get a little bunch. Either way, it's nice to think about lots of different angles, and also, you know, how your stems would come together and meet in the middle. So each one would have a slightly different angle and a slightly different ellipse, and that way you can work out a nice composition and get a really good, interesting collection of flower heads together. So think about the clock when you're drawing and getting all the angles right, and look at the little negative spaces to make sure you've put the petals in the right place. Think about the umbrella to get movement and some kind of dimension into your pictures, and think about ellipses just to get lots of different angles to make it more interesting. I hope that little drawing has helped you, and I hope that you give some live drawing a go, because working from a live flower is so exciting and so interesting.